When Beth and I first got married, we went out and got our first apartment. And let me tell you, it was a spectacular apartment. Well, truthfully, we were young and in love, and it didn't matter what the apartment was like, it was going to be great. But really, it was a great apartment for a young couple just starting out, 2 college students. 2 bedrooms, a full living room, dining room, an eat-in kitchen, a big balcony off the front, stairs downstairs into the basement where we had access to our own laundry, and all for a price that was about half of what we were preparing ourselves to pay for our first apartment. But you know what the best part of our new place was? The best thing about our first apartment was our neighbor, Mrs. Schweitzer, the woman who owned our apartment and lived on the main floor below us. She and her husband owned the main floor. It was a duplex, and we lived upstairs. Mrs. Schweitzer was wonderful, kind, gracious to us. I remember when we first moved in, and I told her that within a year or so that I was going to be moving off to Montreal to go to seminary to study to be a pastor. She said, "Praise be to God! I've got a holy man living above me, a Christian holy man." That made me feel pretty humble. I didn't feel much like a holy man then, and I'm sure I feel like a holy man now, but that's the way she saw me, and really that's the way she treated me, with kindness. And as we got to know each other a little bit better, we exchanged gifts. I remember at Passover, she wanted to share some of her joy of the Passover with Beth and me, so she baked us Passover macaroons. As you know, or probably know, that macaroons are popular at Passover because there's no flour in it. And it helps recall the story of the Hebrew children escaping Egyptian persecution and enslavement by taking no leavened bread with them as they went into the wilderness. And what we did that same week, it was the same week as Easter, is we brought her home an Easter lily from church to share with her some of our joy during the season. She was a fantastic neighbor. She and her husband, Mr. Schweitzer, who didn't talk very much. I don't know whether he had a stroke or whether he just didn't speak English well, or because Mrs. Schweitzer normally liked to carry the conversations. He would sit and nod mostly. But they'd sit on their porch, and whenever we'd come and go, we'd stop and visit with them. They were wonderful, made us feel welcome and supported us as a new young couples first starting out. And we got to know each other well enough that at one point, Mrs. Schweitzer shared with us their story. She said that she had been married once before, and so had her husband. In fact, both of them had been married before, and during the Second World War had been put in boxcars and taken off to Auschwitz, a Nazi concentration camp. Each of them lost their respective spouse in the horrors of that concentration camp. They came away singled because of it. As you know, millions of people lost their lives in those concentration camps. Jews, blacks, gay and lesbian, people with disabilities, anybody who didn't live up to that white Aryan standard were either put out in work camps or they were executed in some of the most inhumane and brutal ways. She and her new husband both lost spouses there in Auschwitz. And when they got to Canada, they were all ready to start a new life, maybe as single people forever and ever, and they met each other in Canada. Both of them having this similar story. By some miracle, by the grace of God, they fell in love again. They fell in love with each other, they got married, and they began their new life together in Canada. I know it took a great deal of courage and even kind of a grace and humility for her to share that story with us. But it mattered, and I needed to hear the story. It stayed with me ever since. It's a reminder to me of our own inhumanity to one another, what can happen if our sinfulness is not kept in check. And it's also a reminder to me of the powerful grace and mercy of God, who is raising us up all the time, allowing us to move forward, to love and to love again. I thank her for sharing that story with me. It was a blessing. I remember one day sitting on the porch with Mrs. Schweitzer, reflecting on our inhumanity to one another in this world. And I said, well, what do you think of your new life here in North America, given the old life that you left behind? And she thought about it for a moment. She nodded. And she said, Mark, I'm Jewish. My next door neighbor is a Muslim from Turkey. Above me, I have a Christian holy man living in my house. She said, this must be heaven. This must be heaven. I've thought about those words throughout my life periodically when I think about the brutality, the horror out of which she came, what she had seen and experienced with her life, and what so many of us experience here in North America. A willingness and a celebration of diversity, a welcome and a hospitality. Here in the United States, we call it the Great Melting Pot, where people from all over the world can come and live this new great American dream. In Canada, they call it a mosaic, where each person brings from that other country this unique identity and becomes part of a greater picture. A melting pot, a mosaic. But it also reminds me of the importance of neighbors and what our neighbors can mean for us here in this great nation and around the world. I asked Mrs. Schweitzer what she thought about her new life in Canada, and she immediately pointed to her neighbors and said, we must be in heaven. We must be in heaven. Jesus said that the second greatest commandment is the same as the first. The second greatest commandment is to love our neighbors as we would love ourselves. Although a lot of biblical scholars say that Jesus was Jewish and he probably wasn't using the Greek language, which has this word self contained in it, whereas in his language, the translation would probably sound more like we are to love our neighbor as one of our own. As one of our own kin, the way people here at Montgomery love newcomers. I have never seen a person come through the doors at Montgomery who is not welcomed as one of our own, as welcomed as a Montgomery person and welcomed into our pews. Jesus said the greatest commandment was love your God, the Lord your God, with all your heart, your soul, your mind, in loose gospel, your strength. And he said the second is the same. Love your neighbor as one of your own kin, or love your neighbor as you would love yourself. Jesus apparently thinks loving neighbor is pretty critical for us. He thinks it's really important for us to love our neighbor because it will reveal something about us and reveal something about God. At the very least, he seems to be saying that if you want to love God with everything you are and everything you have, then you got to love your neighbor too. You can't have one without the other. It's like asking God to forgive you your sins without forgiving the sins of others. How can we love God with all our heart, our soul, our strength, our mind, with everything we have and everything we are, without simply loving our neighbor in a very meaningful and real way? There was a Russian Christian philosopher whose name is Nikolai Berdyaev. I wrote it on the board here because my Russian's not so great. And he said, bread for me is a practical matter, but bread for my neighbor is a spiritual one. Bread for me is a practical question. Bread for my neighbor is a spiritual one. I think Jesus is trying to help us understand the spiritual importance of loving our neighbor in a very practical way. Something happens to us, doesn't it, when we love our neighbor as ourselves, or as one of our own. You know, in Luke's gospel, Luke accounts for this almost the same way. Jesus is being tested by this wise scholar of the Jewish religious establishment, and he's asked the greatest commandment. It's to love the Lord your God with all your heart, your soul, your strength, and your mind. And the second is to love your neighbor as one of your own kin. And this religious scholar is sort of puffed up, and he thinks he can paint Jesus into a corner. He can trick him. He can trap him. And so he asks Jesus this very abstract question about neighbors and neighborliness. He wants to think of neighbors as some sort of philosophical, abstract concept. But Jesus doesn't bite. Jesus actually answers this man's question when he asks, "Who is my neighbor?" Who is my neighbor? Jesus gives him a very real and practical example. That example has become one of the most cherished and beloved stories of our Christian heritage. It's the parable of the Good Samaritan. The one that's probably acted out by more youth group classes on a Sunday morning than any other parable. And you know the story. There's a person walking down the road. He gets mugged, beat up, dumped into the gutter and left to die. And as he's laying there in the street bleeding to death, two of the religious establishment, two great religious leaders, walk by on the other side. Oh, they see him. They know full well that neighbor is in need. They know full well there's been an injustice committed here. They know somebody's been ripped off, beaten up, left to die, no health care. But to them, their religion's more important than their faith. To them, their religion's more important than their spiritual response to a neighbor in need. They don't want to touch the man because it will defile them, right? According to their law. So they walk on by. Walk on by, first one, second one comes along, he walks on by. But then a third person comes along. Not a religious establishment person. Not an organized religion sort of guy. In fact, he wasn't even Jewish. He was a lowly Samaritan, a foreigner, an immigrant. And he comes along and sees that one in the street, beat up, bleeding to death, and he crosses over. And he attends to the man who's broken and lying in the gutter. He bandages him up, says the scripture, and when he gets him well enough to travel, he takes him to an inn. And he says to the innkeeper, "Here is a big sack of money, and I want you to take care of this man until I come back and get him. Until I come back for him again." Jesus said, that's your neighbor. Your neighbor's the person who's in need. A neighbor is one who's in need, and a neighbor is one who cares for one in need. You can't leave neighbor as some sort of philosophical, abstract concept. Neighbor is your neighbor. It's the one in need. And we got a lot of people in need in this world, do we not, folks? I know you got it Mass, but you can say amen. Indeed. Neighbor is the one who's in need. Neighbor is the one who can help the one in need. And I don't know about you, but when I hear that parable of the Good Samaritan, I cannot help but think that maybe Jesus was talking about himself, who crossed over the road and bandaged this one up and took him to the innkeeper and said, "You take care of him until I come back." It's almost as if Jesus came into this world and saw all of us broken and wounded souls. Those of us broken by our own sin, broken by the sins of this world, those who are beat up and dying. And Jesus came and bandaged us up, rescued us, and took us to an inn, a church, and said to the church, "You take care of them. You take care of those wounded souls until I return, until I come back. And here's a big bag of blessings for you to use to take care of those wounded souls so they can heal until I return." No, a neighbor for Jesus is one who is in need and one who has an ability to care for one in need. It's almost as if Jesus wants us to understand not only the practical matter of being a neighbor, but a spiritual matter of being a neighbor. Because you and I both know, don't we, that when we act as a neighbor, when we care for those who are in need, no matter what they look like, no matter the color of their skin, or what language they speak, or what creed they adhere to, something happens to us, doesn't it? When we care for those who are in need, it's like the godly self within us is awakened. It's like the image of God in which we have been created, the image of God in us that has been smudged by this world that wants to bring us down, this world that wants us to think we're divided. And this world that tries to divide us, oh, you're right wing, you're left wing, you're a Republican, you're Democrat, you're a liberal, you're a conservative, you're white, you're black, you're Jewish, you're Christian, you're Muslim, you're Buddhist. This world keeps wanting to put these tags on us, these labels, until the image of God within us is so distorted we can hardly recognize ourselves anymore. And then when we act like a neighbor to someone in need, when we look at them not as a person with a label, but as a person with a need, that image of God within us gets restored. We remember who we are. Our higher humanity begins to reveal itself. We remember that we are actually people created with this wonderful, incredible inner disposition called compassion and mercy. And boy, don't those things feel awesome when we do them? When we get the opportunity to help a neighbor in need, and we do, and we went, wow, that felt pretty darn good. That felt great. And the person who gets help, they're going, oh, thank you so much, I really appreciate it. And what do we normally do? No problem, I was glad to do it. Because it makes us feel great. And it makes us feel great because it helps us remember who we are, sons and daughters of the very one who created us in that one's image. And when Jesus asks us to love our neighbors as ourselves, it's an imperative, but it's also a gift, isn't it? It helps God reclaim us. It helps restore us as God's people. It awakens that godly self within each and every one of us. You know, when I was about 7 years of age, I was growing up in this little bedroom community outside of the city of Toronto. The town was called Bramalea, and it was a place for people who were like first-time home buyers and new Canadians, people just moving to Canada from all over the known world. On our street, we could have called our street United Nations Boulevard or United Nations Way. There was the Giulianos and the Dragas and the Kazupis. And one of my friends, he was from Germany, and his last name was Koch, and his first name was Wolfgang. And the poor kid growing up in Canada with the name Wolfgang. And of course, his parents did not let him down. It was a proud German name for them. And we'd be out playing street hockey on on United Nations Road. We'd be on the street playing road hockey. And his parents would come to the door and they'd say, Wolfgang, please come, it's time for dinner. And we'd go, yeah, Wolfgang, Wolfie, go howl at the moon. But of course, they could tease us for our Italian heritage. And down the road, there were more Germans. And there was a kid who came straight off the boat from England. And, it was ironic because he had such a heavy English accent. We'd tease him and say, can you please speak English? But I remember our neighbors, the Kazupis. Kazupis, ironically, were a very quiet Italian family. And if you know Italian families, it is ironic that there's a quiet one. We tend to be rather vocal. And maybe they weren't quiet, we just couldn't hear them over our own commotion in our house. But they kind of stuck to themselves. They were new to North America. They were trying to make their way in the world. They were very dedicated to their family and very dedicated to growing their family business. And so they didn't maybe mingle with the rest too much. Except for one evening, right after dinner was finishing up. we heard the doorbell ring. And at the front door was Mr. Kazupi. I'd never seen him outside of his house except to get into his car and go and return from work. But here he is at our door. And because he was there, we were very curious. You know, this very mysterious, dark-skinned Sicilian. You know, Italians define, you know, Sicilians are different than Italians. It's a just different kind of Italian. He was Sicilian, very dark-skinned and kind of mysterious-looking character, dark eyes. And he shows up at the door, and he's got this clipboard in his arms, kind of cradled there, almost like a baby in his arms with a pen. And my brothers and I are tucked behind my dad, trying to see, what does this guy want? Mr. Kazupi says to my father, Mr. Giuliano, I've got a petition here I'd like you to sign. I'm going around the neighbors getting them to sign this petition. And my father says, hey, Paisan, what's it for? And Kazupi says, there's a black family trying to buy the house across the street. And I want to get this petition signed to keep black people out of our neighborhood. I know you all thought racism was originated in the South, but no, Canadians got it too. He said, I want you to sign this petition to keep black people out of the neighborhood. And you can imagine my father, you know, looked at Kazupi as this dark, oily-skinned Sicilian saying, Kazupi, if that's not the pot calling the kettle black, you know what it was for us Italians to come to North America, the kind of racism and bigotry we experienced coming here. And I don't know if you all are aware that the Italians were often called the white N word in America. There were laws established in this country to keep Italians out because they weren't considered white. And here in the South, Italians were often lynched because they were seen as somehow white N's who were competing for other jobs and that sort of thing. They experienced a great deal of oppression and had to work real hard to find their way in this North American caste system. And now here's Mr. Kazupi showing up at our door trying to keep another culture down, another people down who are trying to find their way in this new country. I'm very proud of my father, who told Mr. Kazupi, basta, enough. Off you go. I'm not signing your petition. And apparently, Kazupi didn't get enough petitions at all because the black family moved in across the street and Mr. Kazupi moved out. And Mr. Kazupi, he ended up moving to one of the most white, affluent neighborhoods in our area. And there's a part of me as an adult, I wouldn't have thought this as a child, but as an adult, I kind of like to think that when they saw Mr. Kazupi and his family coming in that very white, affluent neighborhood, that some of them got a clipboard and a petition going around that neighborhood trying to keep Sicilians out of their neighborhood. But throughout the years, I've thought to myself, Mr. Kazupi missed it. He missed an opportunity to discover the godly self within himself. Mr. Kazupi missed that opportunity to express Christian hospitality to a neighbor. Can you imagine, instead of getting people to sign a clipboard, if Mr. Kazupi had stayed, and when that family moved in across the street, he took them an awesome Italian lasagna and maybe an awesome bottle of Italian wine and said, welcome. Welcome to the neighborhood. It would have made them feel great, I'm sure, but it would have made him feel great. It would have reminded him perhaps of his own struggle to establish himself in this new country, and it might have awakened him to his own sense of compassion and mercy, his godly hospitality within himself. I worry that he missed it, that he missed that opportunity to love a neighbor as he might love himself. To experience not only the imperative that Jesus gave, the second is the same as the first, love your neighbor as one of your own, but he missed the opportunity to experience the blessing of loving a neighbor, of lifting another human being up, of walking beside them, of standing in solidarity with them, of opening doors for them so that they could make their way in the new world as well. He missed it. If you haven't noticed, I've bookended my message today with two stories of people and how they've dealt with diversity and how they understood neighbors. Mr. Kazupi, in the end, who seemed to miss the blessing right under his own nose. He responded in fear. He responded with hate and bigotry. And the only thing he could think to do when they moved in was to go isolate himself even further, to gate himself in behind the walls of a very affluent and probably a very lonely community for him. At the beginning, though, I shared with you a story of Mrs. Schweitzer, a woman who knows full well what the dangers and the horrors of what hatred and bigotry can bring to this world. A woman who experienced it firsthand. And yet a woman who looked at her neighbors very differently. A woman who looked at her neighbors and saw a Turkish Muslim living next door and a Christian holy man living in the apartment above her and her new husband, and said, you know, this could be heaven. I wonder if Jesus, when he called us to love our neighbor as one of our own, is he blessing us with the opportunity to get a foretaste of what heaven will really be like. A place not of hatred or of bigotry, a place that builds walls and shuts each other out, but a place of compassion and mercy, of hospitality and welcome to us all. It's almost as if Jesus delivered us this wonderful gift, loving neighbors and loving God, two of the greatest blessings we'll ever know. I want to challenge you this week, folks. I want you to think about who your neighbors are. Who's living next door to you? And do you know your neighbors? Do you sit out on the porch and visit with them? Masks on these days, I guess. Though if you're outside, maybe that's a safe place to be. Are the neighbors the people you encounter when you go into the grocery store? Maybe you don't know their names. Maybe they look differently, but maybe you have an opportunity to treat them with a kind of grace and hospitality, the kind of grace and hospitality that each and every one of us has known through Jesus Christ. An unconditional, no strings attached kind of love, mercy and grace, agape, selfless love. I'd like you to think about who your neighbors are and where are those opportunities to care for them, to love them as you might love anyone who walked through the doors here at Montgomery Presbyterian, to love them as one of our own kin or to love them as yourself. And when you do that and you experience that awesome feeling, just say to yourself, wow, this could be heaven. This could be heaven. Praise be to God. Amen.